I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss updates from Ukraine and around the world, and, with our history correspondent Daniel Capurro, look at the invasion of Ukraine in the light of the Second World War.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 7th of December, day 287. And today, I'm joined by our assistant foreign editor Venetia Rainey, our assistant comment editor Francis Durnley, and senior reporter and history correspondent Daniel Capurro. I started by asking Venetia for the latest news from Ukraine.
So I'm going to start in Russia, if that's all right. What we saw late yesterday was a third Russian airfield being bombed. Ukraine hasn't taken responsibility, but I think it's safe to say that they are very happy about it, so we can infer some stuff from that. This is, as I said, the third Russian airfield to be struck. We had two hit on Monday by drones, and now this one in Kursk. Officials released pictures of lots of black smoke above an airfield rising. The governor said it was an oil storage tank that had gone up in flames and that there were no casualties. We don't know many more details than that, but this really shows that Ukraine is starting to hit behind Russia's border, Russia's official border. Blinken came out late last night and said, the US is certainly not encouraging or enabling Ukraine to do this, which heavily suggests that they believe that Ukraine is behind these sorts of strikes. We've also heard that Russia is building its defensive positions inside its own border. Whether this is, propaganda to try and rally an increasingly weary Russian population against the potential of an invasion and sort of talk up that threat. We haven't actually heard that Ukraine is going to invade Russia, or whether the Russians do think that they need to fortify that border a bit more, given that there have been lots of drone strikes. We haven't heard of any personnel going across the border, but lots of unmanned drone strikes happening in Russia. Remains to be seen. So that's all very interesting. We've also hearing continuing rumours in Russia of a second mobilisation. Russia has really been struggling with manpower in Ukraine. They are having to send almost completely untrained troops out to the front line to be put through what's often referred to as the meat grinder. And we're seeing that especially in Bakhmut. This town, previously about 70,000 people, has really become the epicenter of fighting in the east of Ukraine. And the fighting there has been absolutely brutal. Some of the pictures that have been coming out, our listeners might have heard. We were talking about how it was similar to Passchendaele in World War I. Really ground leveled to almost nothing, just trenches and mud and the remaining branches and trunks of blasted off trees. This is really the most medieval form of fighting that you can think of in the 21st century. And hundreds and hundreds of soldiers on both sides are dying every day. Russia needs more men. Ukraine so far seems to have a ready supply. Russia has so far denied that it's going to be issuing a second mobilisation order, but those rumours just won't go away, and we've been reporting on it for the last few weeks. One more thing to flag quickly. Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, has been talking today, and he was saying that Russia is trying to freeze the war so that it can regroup. And I think that's probably accurate. As I was saying, the sort of mobilisation concerns feed into this idea that their troops are just not ready, aren't able to take the fight to Ukraine in any real way. It's been loss after loss after loss for Russia in the last few months. Kharkiv, Kherson. And if Russia wants to regain momentum, then it needs some time to regroup, train up its troops, build back up morale, get together some proper winter kit. And so that's what Russia's trying to do, with the exception of Bakhmut, which we believe the fighting there is largely being driven by the Wagner Group, Putin's sort of pet militia, frankly, at this point, which is trying to hand him a victory, a much-needed victory, perhaps before Christmas, is maybe what they're aiming at by levelling this not terribly important strategy-wise city. So that's the latest from Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Venetia. Francis, can I turn to you? You've been looking at the energy front in Western Europe, and there's also some reports from European diplomacy around the EU price cap on Russian oil. Would you like to talk us through these points?
Certainly. Well, thanks, David, and good afternoon to our listeners around the world. I'll start, as you say, with the energy front, because this has been something, of course, that we've been following very, very closely for months now. And there's been some quite interesting analysis that's come out this morning from a group of experts on the energy market. And they are saying that it will be possible for Europe to make it through this winter without cutting off gas users, despite, of course, the heavily reduced Russian supplies. So that, of course, would tally with what we've been saying for a while now, that it would appear that the market has adapted to the high-level concern that there would be demands from across Europe for users of energy, consumers of energy, to be rationing energy in homes. And of course, we are seeing advice from governments that due to the cost of living crisis and this energy crisis as well, that people should be paying more sensitivity to the amount of energy that they're using. But it has not reached the level that some feared, where that would be mandatory and that it would be far, far more severe and that there would be blackouts, for instance. So some quite promising news there. And obviously, it's worth saying that there is quite a big discrepancy between how different governments are reacting to this. I spoke a little bit last week about some of the fears about how different countries may face higher casualties as a consequence of the energy front, if we articulate it in those terms. I mean, prices have been frozen, for instance, for customers in Spain and France, I think, but in Belgium, for instance, other suppliers have passed down those higher costs to consumers. So you can see that there's a difference in reaction. Of course, when you pass that down to consumers, they really, really will feel it. Here in Britain, there has been support provided by the government, not extensive support, but support that's going to help tide people over, particularly heavy users of energy. So this will help mediate some of the most severe ramifications that were feared of this. But as I say, the most interesting and top line is this belief now that Europe will scrape through, however challenging the winter is, which is, of course, a positive development. Just also remaining on the energy front for a little bit longer, of course, on Monday we saw that the EU price cap on Russian oil came in, and I know that was spoken about in detail on Monday when I was off, but just to update on that, there's already quite significant evidence that the market is being quite heavily disrupted by this. Tankers are piling up off Turkey after Ankara is demanding much more stringent insurance paperwork as a consequence of this price cap. And I won't go into all of the complexities of this, but in essence, they're trying to prevent boats that might be transporting this oil who are under claiming to be EU sanctioned gas when it's actually not. Because of this, they're trying to prevent those ships from disembarking, and this is delaying and holding up the whole process. And so it's just an example, I think, of how actually this is already having quite significant impacts on Russian ability to trade. Just one last story on the energy and gas side of things. The US is to double its gas exports to the UK, it announced earlier this morning. Of course, on the back of this major test of energy resilience. This is, of course, meant to provide, I think, further evidence that the US is going to support Europe this winter as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. But also in the UK's case, I think it's just showing support for what's often articulated as the United States' closest ally on the continent or in the European space. And I think Rishi Sunak the British Prime Minister, of course, has been making a lot of overtures to the United States in recent weeks. And I think this should be seen as a positive sign that things are moving in a positive direction. And just one final word on Zaporizhzhia, because I know some of our listeners have been following this very closely. There is still evidence of continued military activity there. Drones and missiles have rained down on 2 villages overnight, injured 3 people, including a 15-year-old girl. And of course, that's very concerning to those who are monitoring Zaporizhzhia very closely because of the volatility of that site, of course, it being a prominent nuclear power plant. So that's the energy latest. But of course, this is becoming of an increased significance now that we're entering a much colder spell.
Well, thank you very much for all of that, Francis. Francis, can I just stay with you on more story from Europe? Let's move into politics. This is the story that on Tuesday Hungary has blocked a £15.5 billion package of European Union aid to Ukraine. You tell us why. What's happening there?
Well, yes, I've touched on this, I think it was about a week ago, this ongoing saga of Hungary blocking money to Ukraine, whether they would do it or not. And there was a lot of speculation that they might do so. But they didn't initially because they were clearly hoping that the European Commission, which has been threatening certain, not sanctions, but threatening not to give certain money to Hungary out of the EU budget as a consequence of it, what they say is an erosion of democratic standards and a crackdown on gay and trans rights, for instance. And Hungary was still providing financial support for Ukraine in the hope, I think, the last-ditch hope that they would not receive this slap on the wrist from the European Commission. But now that we've heard that they will not be providing the financial support for Hungary, the European Commission, Hungary have now blocked this 15.5 billion in EU aid to Ukraine in a bid, we understand, to force Brussels to release these frozen EU funds to Budapest. So you can imagine the kind of consternation this has caused. Hungary are claiming that it's got nothing to do with Ukraine, that they're just trying to make it very clear that, you know, they envision a slightly different future for Europe, one that's built on strong member states instead of huge piles of common debt. So they're claiming it's due to financial strategy. But you can imagine that quite senior figures in the EU are saying that this is a consequence of Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, having a very soft approach to Vladimir Putin. And of course, Viktor Orban has been very heavily critical of the EU sanctions against Moscow following the invasion. So no doubt this will be an ongoing saga now, but it does show at quite a critical juncture as we enter winter the first signs of quite significant cracking within the EU on this issue of support for Ukraine. But as I say, I don't think this should be seen as something more broad necessarily about Ukraine specifically, but it is an example of where one of the weakest partners on the unitary side of supporting Ukraine is, I suppose, because of their own internal political disputes with the EU, using Ukraine and the significance that is given to Ukraine within the EU at the moment as a leverage point. So, as I say, it's significant for reasons that are more complicated than Ukraine, but no doubt one that will cause some concern in the European Union at this moment, because it will have ramifications on approaching the Ukraine issue in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you very much for all of that, Francis. Dan Capurro, can I turn to you? And just by note of explanation as to why I think we're doing this now, we realised why, as we were preparing the notes for this episode, that this is actually the 200th recording that we've done. This is the 200th episode of Ukraine the Latest. So just very quickly, thank you, all of you, for listening, and thank you, all of the people we've interviewed and spoken to, for all of your thoughts and your expertise. But we thought it might be a good moment for us to take a little bit of a step back and think about the invasion and what's happening, and just see if we can tease some analysis out of this, looking back and comparing it with other periods of history. So, Dan Capurro, you are our history correspondent. You've been looking at the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and just thinking about the Second World War as well. So, can you talk us through some of your thoughts?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on again. I think we'll start narrow and then sort of zoom out from there. I was looking this week, at this trio of raids on air bases on Russian territory, many hundreds of miles from the border, which has sort of shown perhaps this surprising Ukrainian capability that we don't know about. Maybe it's drones, seems to be the most likely candidate. And, earlier raids that we saw during the war, so the sort of famous attack helicopter raid just across the border, the first sort of real strike against Russian territory. And what it really brings to mind is perhaps at least in this country, a forgotten story from the Second World War, which is the Doolittle raid. It's sort of in the news at the moment because the Americans have finally publicly unveiled their replacement for the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, this sort of flying wing. So the new one is the B-21 Raider, specifically named after the Doolittle raiders. Now, anyone who's seen the slightly terrible Ben Affleck, Kate Beckinsale film from 2001, Pearl Harbor, will be familiar with the Doolittle raids. But effectively, in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attacks, which sank a significant number of American ships in Hawaii, in a surprise attack that sort of launched the war in the Pacific from the Americans' perspective and caused a real severe blow to American morale. President Roosevelt was desperate to strike back, basically to prove that the United States was not impotent and could hit back against the Japanese. Now, Japan is a long way away from the United States. It's a long way away from Hawaii even. And so the Americans' ability to strike back was incredibly limited. Later in the war, they would obviously have various island bases from which to operate. But you had this sort of daring raid, really quite spectacular, where they took B-25 Liberator medium bombers, really stripped them of everything, machine guns, supplies, any kind of excess weight. And the plan was to sail them on an aircraft carrier as close as possible to Japan, take off, bomb mainland Japan, bomb Tokyo, supposedly strategically important industrial sites. And of course, you can't land a B-25, which is a fairly large aircraft, back on an aircraft carrier. So they then carried on flying to China, which at the time was an American ally, and crash landed in China. And it was this kind of all or nothing attempt to strike a blow to the Japanese and the Japanese homeland at a time when the United States didn't really have this capability. Now, I think the reason it's sort of an interesting comparison with what's going on in Ukraine is it's very hard to tell, obviously, what the strategic and even tactical impact of these raids in Russian territory are. We believe that some strategic bombers, the Tu-22s and Tu-95s, have been damaged potentially. But again, Russia has a few dozen of each of those aircraft, so it's not particularly clear what the direct impact is. But of course, the ability to raid, to attack, to cause explosions, basically, somewhere that your enemy thought was impregnable, is hugely psychologically important in a war. It was the same with the raid just across the border, that daring raid with the attack helicopters, that Ukraine is really showing its ability to strike the Russian motherland. And Russian civilians who maybe are ignoring the war, pretending it's not there, choosing not to see it, will find that much harder to do and perhaps find themselves worried about their own safety, which puts pressure on Putin. And then, of course, you have the unknown of potential strategic changes. So the impact of the Doolittle raid was relatively limited. It killed about 50 people. It didn't do a huge amount of damage to Japanese industry. It had a big psychological impact. But one argument put forward is that it emboldened the Japanese to try and take out the American carrier fleet, which really pushed them to engage in the Battle of Midway, which turned out to be a terrible disaster for the Japanese, a big turning point in the war, and enabled the Americans to go on the front foot. So you have this question of, even if these raids seem small right now, will they force Putin into strategic miscalculations, force him to redeploy troops at home, move air defenses, or, perhaps, as we've seen with other attacks, for example, on the Crimea bridge, will it, in a fit of rage, will he lash out and potentially miscalculate? So I think that's kind of, an interesting little historical parallel, if you like, there. But zooming out slightly to the bigger picture, the Doolittle raid was a precursor in the Pacific for something that we saw also on an enormous scale in the European theatre of the war, which was this mass bombing of civilians, which to an extent during the war, but certainly afterwards, became hugely controversial. Big questions of whether the Allies were correct to do what they had. Big questions of whether it was ever right to bomb civilians, to deliberately target civilians. And the names of these operations and the cities they struck, Dresden, Operation Gomorrah in Hamburg, where they deliberately created firestorms, became infamous. And when a statue to Arthur Harris, who was head of Bomber Command, was unveiled on the Strand in London. It was graffitied in the 90s. It was incredibly controversial. And it wasn't until, I believe, 2012, I have the year slightly wrong there, that a memorial was finally built to the actual men who served in Bomber Command. So it was always this difficult question of whether the Allies had made the right decision. But the ultimate sort of conclusion of that logic culminated in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the decision that actually, yes, it is right in the long run, in the eyes of the American military at the time, to take out entire cities and huge civilian populations if it meant bringing an end to the war. Now, in the current era, we have shifted hugely away from that. Now, there haven't really been large-scale wars on the European continent since the Second World War until now. But what we've seen in the last 20 years, particularly with the United States, is this move towards sort of precision, almost surgical, I think the Americans would like to call it, attacks with precision-guided munitions, with drones, with Tomahawk cruise missiles, all these kind of things. And obviously, as with all these things, there's a bit of mythology to it. The United States' attacks are never as clean as they sometimes hope and try, or perhaps, depending on your viewpoint, pretend. There are civilian casualties. But the Americans have always argued that they've always made efforts to minimize this. So you saw with the assassination of the formerly number two and the leader al-Qaeda, I believe it was this year, that Biden was only convinced once he saw that he could be taken out on his balcony with a single missile. But what we have with Putin's war in Ukraine is this kind of strange, perhaps unforeseen amalgamation of the two, where for all its flaws, Russia does have the ability to fight precision warfare. It does have precision-guided munitions, even if their supplies are dwindling, and even if they're not as precise and effective as the American ones. But they're resorting to this tactic that perhaps we thought had been left behind in the mid-20th century, of targeting civilians, of terror bombing effectively, because they're using these precision munitions to take out Ukraine's electricity grid. And of course, as we've heard many times on this podcast, that doesn't just mean power cuts. It means no heating. It means no water, because running water is reliant on electricity run pumps. So it's almost this reversion to a 1940s strategy, and it opens up a lot of questions. Once you decide that such strategies are permissible, are justified, where do you draw the line? The West has been fairly unanimous in its condemnation of what Putin's doing, but if he, in his own thinking, thinks this is justified, where does he draw a line? We've seen this with the question of nuclear weapons, and whether Putin would really be willing to use them. If you're willing to freeze and starve death effectively, and to try and force them into being refugees, what more might you be willing to do, particularly if your ability to fire precision munitions runs out, and you're left with blunter instruments? And we saw that in the Second World War, that even the good guys are willing to take this logic to its extreme. So it's really an open question. But of course, at the same time, many of the unanswered questions about the bombing war in the Second World War, still hotly debated today, are whether it actually worked. Now, the atomic bombing of Japan clearly did work, because the Japanese surrendered. Whether the cost was worth it remains open to debate, but it worked. But the European bombing wars and the earlier fire bombings of Japan, Tokyo, remain deeply controversial among historians as to what the impact was. So historians like Max Hastings argue that it was ineffective, that really they didn't do very much to damage German industrial capacity, and that they didn't really affect morale. They perhaps stiffened it, or that, what difference civilian morale make in a society in which public dissent was not possible. Other historians argue the opposite. It's probably too big a debate to go into in any depth. But again, we see this in Ukraine, where there is, to an extent, defiance. And obviously people can't defy practicality and reality. And if we reach a situation where there's no running water in Kiev, it will be very, very difficult for people to stay. And something will need to be done. Obviously, prevention is better than a cure. But what we've seen so far from the Ukrainian people is defiance, and signs of this terror bombing really doesn't work.
That's absolutely fascinating. Very, very quickly, Dan, can I just ask you, we were talking about some of your notes before coming on and talking about this. And something that I've heard from a lot of people is this idea that one of Putin's sort of maybe unexplained objectives is to take us back to what he sees as the sort of the good old days, where the sort of Soviet hierarchy ran everything. I mean, you see this in the gangster state he runs. I'm just wondering what you think, whether he in his own mind hadn't moved on from that sort of Second World War way of thinking that these terror bombings were an effective tool. As you said, they were used by all sides in the Second World War. And actually, what we've seen in the past 9 months is that the rest of the world actually has moved on, and that's demonstrated in the extreme revulsion and rejection of the targeting of civilians. I just wondered if you had thoughts on that.
Absolutely, and I think there's yes, certainly context is everything, and with the American drone strikes and the like, there was always the question of the justification and the justification of the war, and we're not fighting Nazis anymore. No one outside of Russia, I think, no one serious outside of Russia thinks that this is a justified war, and so how could the ends ever possibly justify the means? But yes, you're effectively seeing, we saw this with Putin's approach to history, where he basically has this almost 19th century Bismarckian approach of, great powers do what they want and they have spheres of influence, and effectively rejecting 70, 80 years of consensus on the importance of self-determination and the sovereignty of nations of any and all sizes. And so in a lot of ways, it's really not surprising that he sees any means to his ends as justifiable and sees it as perfectly legitimate to terrorize civilians. I think also perhaps he taps into quite heavily the mythology, the legend of the Great Patriotic War, as Russians and many people in post-Soviet states know the Eastern Front, the Second World War. And of course, during that war, horrendous atrocities took place and enormous sacrifices. And the Soviet Union really did just throw people at the problem. And you can see that with his approach, with the Russian military's approach, with its own population, with its own soldiers, the way they just treat them like meat to be shoved into the grinder in places like that. So yeah, I think it's the Second World War clearly looms large in Putin's thinking, and he has not moved with the rest of the world in his attitude to war and his attitude to geopolitics.
Francis, I know you wanted to come in and add your thoughts to this.
Well, yes, I totally echo what Daniel was just saying there. I remember one of my most abiding memories of when I went to Russia a few years ago was the sense in which this is a country where the Second World War, which to us may feel like an event that was many, many decades ago, as of course it was, albeit a vitally important one. In Russia, it's much more prominent in the consciousness of the state. It really feels as if it was fought 10 years ago rather than over 70. And of course, that has an impact on the culture and attitude on military matters and on foreign affairs. I mean, of course, as have spoken about now for months, the reason that the Ukrainians and Zelensky were articulated as Nazis by Putin is because of the power of that war in the consciousness. And it was believed to be an effective means of gaining support for the war. Now, of course, as we've talked about recently, there is evidence that support is declining, and indeed the messaging has also eroded about them being drug-addled Nazis, which was the term that was often used. And so I think that is significant. I think also as well, just touching on something else that Dan said, is the way in which we in the West, I think, have been rather naive about the kind of moral universe that Putin is operating in on military matters. We have thought that he was operating as this sort of chess grandmaster, moving pieces around the board, that he was still operating in the same rational realpolitik universe that we, often, if not live in, but understand in the West. But actually, if you look at the wars that Putin has been engaging in now for decades, they are not and have not been utilizing the normal moral views of war for almost ever since he's been in power. You look at Chechnya, you look at Syria, of course, most recently. And this was a war that was fought in the most absolutely brutal manner possible, as Hamish de Bretton-Gordon has spoken about on this podcast many times. The kind of destruction of cities that is being wrought in Ukraine was something that the very commander now in charge of the Russian forces was involved in an attempt to back up Bashar al-Assad in his fighting in that war. So we have not been watching Russia closely enough. And what may seem shocking to us is probably not shocking at all to the commanders who have been thinking and have been commanding Russian troops and have been involved in foreign wars now for some time. So I think that is an example of the disconnect between Western leaders and Russian ones, is on this fundamental question about what is permissible in war. And, I keep thinking back to when that plane was shot down over Ukraine that killed almost 300 innocent civilians. That was a classic example that showed how the very fact that was conceivable to happen by so-called separatists in the Donbass, the fact that was even conceivable to happen showed that certain risks were being made by the Russian state in how they were operating militarily. And that should have been a huge red flag, I think, morally and politically, as to how Putin was willing to operate. And that's before you even bring in this vast scale of political assassinations and murders across European soil, including here in Britain, by the Russian intelligence services. So really, this shouldn't come as a shock to us, but the fact that it does, I think, speaks volumes.
Well, thank you, Francis. Dan, can I come back to you just for one final point about industry and industrialisation and arms supplies? I think that's quite apposite considering how often we talk about often Western, sometimes not, of course, supplies of armaments to Ukraine. And what do you see? How do you see the parallels with the Second World War there?
Absolutely, yeah. So just, for sort of slightly broader context, we're going into winter and whether it's weather related or not, the war's slowing down a bit. There's a pause, both sides sort of consolidating, rebuilding capacity. And obviously there's still confidence within Ukrainian command, or at least public confidence, that they can end this war quickly. But as it looks likely to go into 2023 and beyond, possibly beyond, the question of a long war arises, and the question of how do you continue to supply it. Now, we've seen the United States really going all around the world and negotiating left, right and center to an extent for old Soviet munitions, which mostly the West does not make. One or two NATO members, I think Bulgaria, have some capacity to manufacture it, but very, very limited, and just trying to get hold of any that they can to send to Ukraine so they can keep using their Soviet era artillery. But even to an extent with with NATO standard artillery, the 155 shells, you saw South Korea appeared to be wanting to support Ukraine, but obviously can't for various legal constitutional reasons. But it has sold shells to the United States and on the explicit basis that they not to be used in Ukraine. But of course, if the Americans have purchased those, they can then send some of their own that they already had over to Ukraine. But what we're seeing is basically whether the lean post-Cold War military industry in the West is capable of sustaining a long war. The amount of artillery, shells and rockets being used in Ukraine, I think, has staggered even the most pessimistic of experts. Huge amounts of ammunition being churned through. And, there's a report a couple of weeks out by RUSI looking at the early stage of the war, the kind of the decisive moments, Battle of Kiev, and how they were won. One of the big major findings was that despite, the kind of social media and the media obsession with drones and with NLAWs and javelins and other anti-tank missiles, really what stopped that convoy, what kept Kiev safe, what turned the Russians back, was that it just has an immense amount of artillery. I think that, according to the report, if you look at tube artillery, as they call it, which is sort of traditional artillery that you would think of with a long barrel, and rocket artillery combined, Ukraine had more than Britain, France, Italy, Spain and Poland put together. So in a lot of ways old-fashioned, but whether it's artillery or NLAWs or precision guided munitions, you're still looking at the same question, which is, can they be manufactured quickly enough to replace stockpiles? Because that's what we're relying on really is stockpiles. And this is where, the Second World War comparison comes in. So, the United States was famously dubbed the arsenal of democracy. Lots of people know about the Lend-Lease program, where the Americans supplied Britain and the Soviet Union predominantly with huge amounts of material and ammunition over several years, basically kept them in the fight, allowed them to continue fighting Nazi Germany. And, the traditional story that's told is that, the United States ramped up industrial production massively, dedicated its economy to the war, and was able to churn out huge amounts of products. And to an extent, that's true. The kind of the emblematic symbol of this is the Liberty ships. An immense number were produced, something like 3 every 2 days over a 4-year period, the most of any one kind of ship ever produced. And these were effectively civilian merchant convoy ships that would replace all the ships that kept being sunk by German U-boats to keep Britain fed. But the reality of this arsenal of democracy kind of legend, I wouldn't call it mythology because it did happen, is that it took a lot longer to ramp up, and it was a closer run thing than people realized. So really, it began in 1938 and it didn't reach its apogee until 1944, which is when the United States was really able to kind of lean into the war, both in the Pacific and Europe. And so that's 6 long years. And a good example of this is that if you look at capital ships, so big ones, battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, none of the ships that were ordered after the Pearl Harbor attack on the United States actually served in the war, because it took so long for them to come online. So actually the ships that did serve in the war, if they didn't already exist or they weren't already in the United States Navy, the new ones coming in had actually been ordered well before 1941. And of course, in the present day, that raises a lot of questions of how can we continue to supply Ukraine with sort of basic munitions, 155 shells. The more sophisticated ones, javelins, NLAWs and the like. And also, of course, particularly the United States, but NATO members more generally have to maintain their own stockpiles, maintain their own ability to fight another war. Now, for Europeans, maybe that seems less urgent because the likelihood of Russia being able to do anything outside of Ukraine is very limited. But of course, the Americans are looking over their shoulders at China and Taiwan and the issue there, and they need to be able to keep things in reserve. And of course, the issue with China as well is that while we all hope it won't happen, you have to prepare for what's known as a general war. And, there's a CSIS, a Center for Strategic and International Studies report last year, which looked into American military industrial capacity. And in a lot of ways, quite worrying. During the Cold War, there was this idea of industrial surge. There was spare capacity in the economy. It was designed in a way, and there were government policies to encourage the ability to turn it on, basically, if there are a war, to switch civilian production, to ramp up production of all kinds of key armaments material. And it was abandoned, like a lot of things. The peace dividend, it was abandoned at the end of the Cold War. And to an extent, there's renewed interest in rebuilding it, but progress is slow, and to an extent it's not there. So when we talk about, the Liberty ships, these are very, very straightforward, unarmed vessels, and that's why you were able to churn out 3 every 2 days. But you look now at the complexity and the difficulty of replacing ships, to use an example of something big and difficult. So CSIS estimated that to replace just the 11 aircraft carriers that the United States has would take 50 years at current sort of production rates. So that kind of gives you an idea of the difficulties that the West is facing. Now, I was talking to you earlier before we came on, David, about this, that, we had, over the last 2 years, we've had this shock with COVID that has really changed how people think about a lot of things, how they think about democracies versus autocracies, but also how they think about supply lines and production. And you've seen this kind of move away from just-in-time delivery and a move towards resilience. Now, the military is slightly different. They do have big stockpiles of things. But again, you're seeing this shock with Russia's invasion of Ukraine that actually maybe we do need to rethink the way we've done things since the end of the Cold War. We do need bigger stockpiles, but also we need bigger spare capacity in the system. Again, this is another sort of parallel with the Second World War, is that the Second World War basically dragged the United States out of the Great Depression to a large extent. But because the economy had been depressed, there was huge spare industrial capacity just waiting for something to be done, and huge amounts of unemployed men or underemployed men and women, of course, who could go into the factories and do this stuff. And that's just not reflective of what Western economies look like today. There is very little spare capacity. And of course, everything is dispersed and globalized. So one of the big questions for the United States is a huge number of the chips that go into things like the microchips, that go into things like Javelin missiles are produced in Taiwan and South Korea, two countries which are obviously incredibly exposed and vulnerable if the United States were to enter into a confrontation with China.
Thank you very much for that, Dan. Francis, I believe you have a few more updates for us that actually flow quite nicely from some of the things that Dan's been saying.
Yes, they do. And I think it's worth that we draw attention to these on the back of what Dan was saying there, because US lawmakers have agreed to provide Ukraine with at least $800 million new dollars, in addition to the security assistance guarantees that have already been made. And of course, this is significant because of the current precarious situation, and for all of the reasons that Daniel was just talking about there, that this is an example of the kind of support that is required, because in Europe there is unfortunately a lack of financial means, one could say, but certainly military means as well at the moment. Of course, the Finnish Prime Minister, as we spoke last week, flagged this, that there are serious concerns about military capacity issues in Europe, and we're relying on the United States to provide that support. And, there are some commentators who say that really this, whilst this is a fight that the West is right to be collectively supporting, that really Europe should not be reliant on the United States to be supporting Ukraine financially. Of course, the EU is doing a lot, but actually this is the EU's fight. It matters far more to the EU, the defence of its territory, than it does to the United States. So I think this should be seen in that context. Interestingly as well, we're seeing that this is all coming under the auspices of the fiscal 2023 National Defence Authorization Act, that there's $858 billion in sort of defence policies, etc., etc. And as part of that, they're boosting Taiwan. They're giving more billions in aid to Taiwan over several years. Now, why are they doing that? Well, we've seen, of course, as the context of Ukraine, that there is a emerging concern that China, with its rather bellicose rhetoric with regard to Taiwan, may use this as a moment when the West is distracted to do some kind of invasion in the coming years there. So by bolstering support for Taiwan, it's making it clear to China that the West is watching there, and of course as well making it more difficult for any possible potential invasion by China to succeed if you're funneling billions in support to Taiwan. So I think we should just say that there's a lot going on in this space about building capacity that Daniel was talking about, building financial resilience, whether that be in Europe or in nations that are sensitive on these matters, and it is the United States that's leading the front. It has to be said. Just one other story as well, which I think is interesting in the military context as well, which is that Poland is preparing to deploy the German-made Patriot air defense system on its territory. This comes, of course, on the back of the military accident that we understand happened. That seems to be the consensus now, that the Ukrainian defense missiles misfired and, of course, landed in Poland and killed 2 people. And as a consequence of this, the Germans have provided this support for Poland. So it's a defensive measure that would enable them to stop these missiles. I think it's just a further example of how Europe is trying to put forward a united front on this and to work cooperatively. But for the reasons I was talking about earlier on, there are immense challenges in that, as different leaders have different stances on the best way to proceed. And of course, as well, the differences in opinion about the importance of sanctions on Russia in the long term. But this is, I think, another positive sign that should be said, that Germany has been willing to give this support to Poland, because it not only would bolster them from accidental missiles from Ukraine, but of course is another effective deterrence for Russia. And I think it is really important to underline that people in Poland are very, very concerned about what is going on in Ukraine at the moment. They share a border, of course. They've taken in millions upon millions of Ukrainian refugees, but also they know, if you speak to Polish people, they know what Russia is capable of. It doesn't shock them, the stories that we've been seeing of Ukraine. And so naturally they are one of the countries in Europe that has had the strongest line on how Russia should be deterred, and have provided the most steadfast support of Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much, Francis and Dan, and earlier Venetia, for your time today. I think we're unfortunately coming to the end of the episode today. So can I just get your final thoughts? What will you be thinking of in the days to come, and what would you really want our listeners to understand?
Shall I jump in here? Right. Yes. So I think, again, we're talking about the 200th episode and looking at the big picture and the war entering into a second year. There was an interview that Serhiy Plokhy, the Ukrainian-American historian, who with El País, Spanish newspaper, and he made a point which I think we perhaps all know, but have not always had at the forefront of our minds, which is that ultimately, whatever happens with territory, whatever happens with Crimea, whatever the borders of Ukraine end up looking like, it has won the war, and it will join the West, turn to the West, culturally, economically, geopolitically. And Russia, whatever paltry successes or not it gets out of this war, has lost in the long run. It's diminished economically, demographically. Its brand, if you want to use a slightly crass term, has been diminished massively. And Putin is and will continue to be a pariah on the global stage.
Thank you very much, Dan. Francis Sternley, would you like the very final thoughts?
Well, thank you, David. I know I've been returning to this theme a lot recently, but I think it's because we're getting a lot more information on it, and I think it's right to draw attention to it. So I've been reading a story in the Associated Press about the hours after Russia invaded back in February, and the reaction from health staff at a children's hospital in the south of Ukraine, which started immediately secretly planning how to save the children at the hospital. They'd already heard rumours and concerns that Russia was thinking of seizing orphan children and sending them to Russia. So, according to this report, the staff at the Children's Regional Hospital in Kherson began fabricating orphans' medical records to make it appear that they were too ill to move. And they've got an interview there with the head of intensive care. She says, "We deliberately wrote false information that the children were sick and could not be transported. We were scared that the Russians would find out, but we decided that we would save the children at any cost." Now, of course, it's worth underlining here that we know of at least 1,000 children who've been seized from schools and orphanages in Kherson. There's much higher figures that have been also talked about of children being taken away, but we just don't know yet where they are or what those true figures may be. But we do know for certain that in Kherson there have been at least 11 babies that were sent to Crimea. Perhaps as many as 50 children were evacuated in October, either to Russia or to Crimea. And there's descriptions in this article of how that occurred exactly. A bus came with the inscription Z, of course, being the symbol painted on Russian vehicles, and simply took the children away. So, as I say, we don't know the full facts yet and the full scale of this, but whenever we get a shard of information like this, which of course is being discovered as territory is liberated and journalists are able to get there and interview people, then I think it's right to draw attention to it, because as I continue to say, I think this will be one of the great unknown or underreported aspects of this war when we look back on it in the years to come.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast by The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can also listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, do leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there's sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you do want to hear an episode as soon as possible, it's available on your podcast apps. Please search for Ukraine the Latest on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred app. Check out the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.